Hey, this is C&D Channel. I'm Chris. This is MMA for you. A lot of people are asking me about Scott Coker being named as president of Bellator and how Viacom pretty much removed Bjorn Rebney and Tim Danaher from their positions in Bellator. So I'm going to go talk about that right now. Just a little history. I'm going to quote a lot of like Luke Thomas's article of from MMA Fighting. Scott Coker proves Bjorn Rebney did a good job but wasn't the right man for it. And just to see the implications of this move, is Scott Coker the right guy? Why wasn't Bjorn Rebney the right guy moving forward with Bellator? So, to sum up what happened, from what I heard, this is something that has been going on between Rebney and Viacom for a long time. They have had huge disagreements. One part of it was that Bjorn Rebney is so stuck on the Bellator tournament format, and it just wasn't feasible for what Viacom was trying to achieve, or even just to put that many tournaments onto television. You could already see a logjam starting to form because of the tournament format. And what its original purpose did, it can't really do for the Bellator of now, as opposed to the Bellator that Bjorn Rebney started. He was also difficult to work with behind the scenes, and Rebney was not the most liked guy in MMA circles. There's a whole thing with him being a boxing promoter, something about him killing a dog or something like that. All those contract things that were going on with Eddie Alvarez, stuff with Askren, Tyson Nam, you name it. There's a lot of stuff contractually with Bellator and Rebney, or that happened contractually, especially with Rebney, that just wasn't favorable to MMA fans. The other thing is that despite all that negativity, there was actually a lot of tweets from a lot of fighters that fought in Bellator that actually spoke really well of Bjorn Rebney. So despite the, negativity that kind of surrounds Rebney within like the hardcore MMA circles and whatnot, to quote a couple things from Luke Thomas, the Bellator Rebney created was essentially built to survive. And compared to other organizations like Elite XC, IFL, Affliction, Bellator, by contrast, is now in the 5th year of its existence. It held 121 events under Rebney's reign. So, there's a lot of things that Rebney did that were really good for Bellator and were admirable. Not many MMA promoters were able to do as much as Bjorn was able to do for Bellator. The problem with Rebney, though, and Luke kind of says it right here, there's actually a couple problems. Because originally his tournament format was particularly useful for a burgeoning organization trying to establish hierarchy among its talents and its nascent status. This is all according to Luke Thomas. The tournament worked for Bellator because it naturally sorted the wheat from the chaff at a time when the roster was inundated with unknowns and many unprovens. As time passed, the leaders of the various packs began to distance themselves and catch attention for their relative prowess. So there's guys like Pat Curran, Patricio Pitbull, Daniel Strauss. Those three managed to really separate themselves in like featherweight and lightweight. You have Chandler and Eddie Alvarez, and then Will Brooks kind of joined that group as well. So that's what it did. It didn't need to, the tournaments didn't really need to continue though, because they already built that hierarchy. Personally I understood what the tournaments were trying to do. You had new prospects, a 2 to 3 month period where these prospects would fight, 3 times in the tournament, 8-man, for a maximum of like 3 times within like a 2 to 3 months season. And eventually you get to know this fighter. Usually it's a prospect, and it's just an easy way to get to know a fighter and for this said fighter to, in a sense, fairly get into title contention. I don't think, even with the 4-man tournament, I don't think anyone was saying that the winner of the tournament didn't deserve to be the next title contender. Of course, like I said, log jams happened. I mean, there was just, in lightweight, there's like guys waiting for title shots are like Dave Jansen, Daniel Weichel, and as far as I can tell, fighters that are granted title shots may not, under this new regime, may not receive title shots, or their title shots just aren't guaranteed, pretty much. And for the divisions with the log jams, it actually kind of makes sense. So yeah, I understood the tournament format and the tournament model. I didn't think that it was the worst thing in the world, especially for a promotion that promoted primarily prospects in the higher weight divisions like light heavyweight and heavyweight. Understandably, they'd get more UFC fighters or former UFC fighters or former Zuffa fighters just because the talent is just so low. It's so hard to find quality talent in the higher weight classes. Another thing that Luke said was, and moving forward though, there's a couple problems with the tournament format. One, Rebney was always right in that the UFC's model of putting fights together had issues. That's, a guy with an 8-fight winning streak may not get a title shot, but the guy with a 2 or 3 fight winning streak would. For example. However, what he said, no one ever clamored for a solution that called for removing the matchmaker altogether. And that's one thing I really agree with Luke there. It's an alternative, but it's an alternative that people weren't exactly clamoring for. They didn't see, they saw the issues, but they weren't thinking that it was that bad. And from the most part, it just kind of seemed like people favored pretty much quote-unquote traditional matchmaking. And, the tournaments were an idea, but I don't know if it really added, especially in the later stages, if it really added to Bellator's bottom line. I think that it was just kind of there. I personally did feel that they had too many of them. And finally, another thing that he said was that Bellator's design was survival, which has enormous value, but isn't conducive to audience gathering or retention. That's where Scott Coker comes in. Yes, Bellator could go from one state to the next, holding tournament after tournament, finding a few promising talents along the way. But who was there to watch live? They ran in Indian casinos. I heard that their gates aren't very good. For that matter, who was there to watch on television? Bellator has turned in promising numbers on Spike from time to time, but never consistently. And yeah, that's pretty much the truth of the matter. Is that the formula that they were able to make and the model that they use at times could have good numbers. Other times, decent to bad numbers. I mean, there's no real consistency. You didn't really see or have this idea of growing, like a growing audience per se. You know what I mean? And you don't really see this, think of this idea of like a Bellator. I've seen a couple of them. A very small few of like these Bellator diehard fans. There aren't many of those. There's people that know Bellator, like watching it, like it enough. But really, there's a lot of apathy and indifference towards the product at the same time. They did manage to go to pay-per-view, and from what I heard, the pay-per-view numbers did well. Surprisingly well. I think I talked about it. The show was a bit strange in a sense, with one of the fighters telling off Bjorn Rebney. You got kind of the freak show fight in there. It was a fun show. I don't know how much, if it was conducive to growth. I think it just kind of showed that Bellator can put on a pay-per-view if given the right matchups. So yeah, I mean, pretty much to sum it up, I mean, Rebney, his model was good to start the promotion. He could help it survive. Pretty much the bottom line, though, is his model and his vision could not really allow it to grow in this MMA landscape and in this particular Bellator. They now have the established fighters in pretty much all their weight divisions, and sometimes because of the format, the tournament format, they couldn't even put on the big fights. I mean, they could have put Rampage versus King Mo pretty much early on, pretty much right when they signed him. The tournament format made it so like King Mo had, went through the tournament, got knocked out and by like Emmanuel Newton, and it's like, well, then they made like a 4-man tournament with Rampage and King Mo in different brackets. Both of them won their brackets, and now they could fight each other because of the tournament. Instead of doing it, it's a really roundabout way for those two to fight each other. Whereas with traditional matchmaking, more likely than not, that's the money fight. They would have just put it together a lot more immediately. And that is actually something that Scott Coker is known for doing. I mean, look at Gina Carano versus Chris Cyborg. He put that out. Once he was able to get those fighters under contract, I mean, he kind of just put that fight together right away. Or fun fight together. I mean, like, Fedor Dan Henderson. Fedor versus their good heavyweights, pretty much. Obviously, he did do the Grand Prix. But Scott Coker can do big fights. Frank Shamrock versus Diaz, Kung Lee Shamrock, Gracie, Melendez versus Thompson, 1 and 2. 3 wasn't really... 3 kind of came during the dying days of Strikeforce. But for the most part, Scott Coker kind of knew how to make big fights and make events feel pretty big. I mean, I think a lot of people still remember Nick Diaz, Paul Daly, and that was one of the best rounds of MMA I've ever seen. It was like one round. It was awesome. And I guess that kind of segues into what Scott Coker can do for Bellator. He can create bigger fights. I can see him probably doing like Alvarez versus Chandler 3. He wants to move the needle. And he's kind of the guy to do that. He has various ways of doing that. He talked about co-promotion. That is not the first time that Scott Coker has done for co-promotion. He has co-promoted with M1 through Fedor. He has co-promoted with Dream, having guys like Shinya Aoki and Tatsuya Kawajiri fighting in their promotion. And vice versa. Josh Thompson fought Kawajiri in Dream, if I'm not mistaken. He's better at fighter and like manager relations since he's generally easier to work with. People like Scott Coker. Whereas with Bjorn Rebney, he was known to be difficult to work with. So I think that kind of helps. And as far as the tournament structure goes, Scott Coker actually has had plans and has actually done like that heavyweight Grand Prix with like Karatanov, Rogers, Orlovsky, Barnett, Verdum, Overeem, Bigfoot, and Fedor. I mean, that was a pretty big deal during the time. He's not opposed to doing tournaments, just to do tournaments when they made sense. Even in this one article I read about the history of Strikeforce and Bloody Elbow, I believe he talked about that he wanted to do a lightweight tournament, but it just never came to pass. And even, I believe, a middleweight tournament, it just never happened. I mean, it's a combination of timing and having the right guys. With Rebney, he would kind of just do a tournament. He would grab like a bunch of prospects, put them in a tournament. But the problem is, he didn't really build excitement for these guys. So you're just kind of like, who are these guys? What's so special about this tournament? How come they're doing another? And sometimes something that's a bit head scratching is like, how come they do another tournament when there's kind of like a logjam of contenders already? Like, it was weird to do another lightweight tournament when like Dave Jansen didn't even get his title shot, and they're talking about doing like, Chandler Alvarez 3. And it's like, well, Will Brooks is also like the interim champion, so it's just kind of like, it was kind of odd to do another like tournament with like Daniel Weichel winning, and then they did another one with the finals with Marcin Howard versus Patricky Pitbull, and that fight hasn't happened. I don't know if it will. It was really odd. It's like, how come you're doing another lightweight tournament with all these contenders? I don't understand. It doesn't really make sense. So, like I said, with Scott Coker, he can do tournaments. He has done tournaments, except he does it when they make sense. The other thing that was also talked about was the loss of seasons. So, pretty much they had like the fall season. They'd skip for a couple months, and I think they'd do like a winter Bellator, and then they had the summer series, which was only like three events. I'll say this actually, I was actually not opposed to the seasons. I honestly felt that having Bellator on a weekly time slot, on the same channel, on the same time slot, is actually good. Is actually a good thing. Because people that have watched it know it's on. So they'll go back to it. We're like the whole creatures of habit thing. It's like, if you want to get your MMA fix, maybe you don't even know a UFC event is on during the weekend. Maybe you don't watch FS1 or whatever. But if you know that, if you've been watching Bellator every week on Friday at, like, for me, it's 6 p.m., guess what? When Friday 6 p.m. comes along, maybe I'll check Spike TV. Hey, they have the fights on. Cool, I'll watch it. I'm getting my MMA fix. And you kind of condition yourself, and the network kind of conditions you, hey, Bellator's on during this specific time, on this specific date, and eventually it just becomes habit to watch it. If you kind of spread out your events, there's no, unless you know that the event is happening that day, maybe you don't flip to the channel. That's the thing. I don't always know. I was checking out like a comment section, and it's like, man, one guy didn't even know that like next week was like the Stevens versus Cub Swanson card. It's gonna be on like FS1. Like no one, he didn't even know that. And he goes to MMA sites. It took him like a week before to know that there was a UFC event. The UFC does put events out more frequently, but it's on like Fox, FS1, Fight Pass, and or pay-per-view. So it's not on a consistent channel. So that's why I kind of like seasons. It's just, hey, there's Bellator on Friday. You kind of knew Bellator would be on Friday for X amount of weeks. And I thought that's actually a good thing. But I don't know with their loss of seasons. I just don't know what they're going to do. I would just assume that they're going to put events out somewhat sporadically. Another thing that came into attention was, and a lot of people are talking about this, was changing the name of Bellator MMA. That wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. The idea of rebranding it, because the problem with Bellator MMA, in a sense, is that it carries whatever negativity came with Bellator MMA comes with the name. So when a person that may not like Bellator sees the name Bellator, they think, oh man, they're the organization that screwed over Eddie Alvarez. They're the organization that screwed Ben Askren, they're that organization that has those really ironclad bad contracts. So if you change the name, I don't know what the name's going to be called. That association doesn't necessarily exist anymore, and you kind of get a further idea of change. Hey, it's not called Bellator MMA. It's called, I don't know, whatever. There's just this idea of, oh, hey, it's changing. Maybe I'll give it a chance. And that's the other thing that's really odd about this. Not odd, but that's just that you gotta wonder about this whole situation too. Is the contracts. One of the biggest things that works against Bellator and works against them as far as getting some of the bigger names or some of the bigger prospects and whatnot are the contracts. There's just like 1 year no compete clause after a contract's over, and it's pretty much if you're like a tournament winner, a tournament finalist, or become a champion, you get like, it's up to Viacom's discretion if they want to extend your contract. You can't do anything about it, so you might get signed for like 3 more fights when maybe the UFC comes a calling. The problem is with the contracts though is I don't know if Scott Coker can do anything about it. For one, I doubt he can do anything about them now. The contracts that exist that the fighters signed now, I think they're kind of stuck with that. I don't know contract law or anything like that, though. But I would assume so. And moving forward, is Bellator going to have those same type of contracts? One thing that's really interesting and with this MMA landscape, it's just that like the UFC has over like 500 fighters on the roster. They're putting like, I don't know, 50 plus events. Where are they gonna find, like, Coco talked about, like signing some new guys, getting the roster bigger, bolstering the roster and whatnot, getting big names. It's like, well, what big names are out there? I mean, that's the thing. The only thing I can think of is they can co-promote with like ONE FC maybe and get Ben Askren. And maybe they get Bibiano Fernandez. Bibiano Fernandez versus Eduardo Dantas would be cool, I suppose. I don't think they can co-promote with World Series of Fighting, though. It's Spike. It's a Viacom property, and I know with, like, NBC Sports, I don't know if they're under that same property. I don't know if they can even co-promote. That would be kind of cool if they could, but I don't know if it's possible. And then as far as free agents go, I mean, who's out there? Maybe Mamid Khalidov can fight Shlemenko? I mean, is that what we're looking for? Maybe bringing back the female fighters. Even then, I mean, most of the best ones are at the UFC. And then as far as the strawweights go, all of them are pretty much, except for like Jessica Aguilar, are in the UFC or Invicta. So maybe they can do 145. They won't have Cyborg because she's with Invicta. Maybe they can do Marina Shafir. I don't know. She's one of like Ronda Rousey's training partners and whatnot. She's getting some press these days, But that's pretty much it. Like, I don't know who they can get. If they can get fighters whose contracts in the UFC are going to be up, up for negotiation, maybe they can make a bid on those guys, but for the most part, I just don't know what they can do really and who they can get outside of Bellator, outside of the UFC, outside of World Series of Fighting that's interesting to the fan base. It seems really odd to me. I mean, if they can co-promote with World Series of Fighting, that's probably one of the bigger things that they can do. And have fights between their Justin Gaethje, or the winner of Newell versus Justin Gaethje versus the trifecta of like Eddie Alvarez. If Eddie Alvarez even sticks with Bellator, I don't even know. Will Brooks and Michael Chandler, because I don't know what's going on with them. I think Marlon Moraes versus Eduardo Dudu Dantas. Rick Glenn just beat Georgie Karakanian. He's probably going to fight Lance Palmer. One of those three guys fighting. Actually, that's pretty cool. You have Rick Glenn, Georgie Karakanian, and Lance Palmer, who are the top featherweights in World Series of Fighting. And there's 3 top featherweights in Bellator with Patricio Pitbull, Freire, Pat Curran, Daniel Strauss, and you can do matchups between the 6 of those guys. That'd be kind of neat. But otherwise, even like World Series of Fighting doesn't have that many fighters. With welterweight, it's all former UFC guys, so they have like Payares versus Lima. I guess that'd be kind of cool. David Branch just beat Taylor, so Branch versus Shlemenko, I suppose. I mean, but like even then, you're kind of just scraping at the bottom of the barrel. It's like even if you could get some sort of interesting fights, I mean, Justin Gaethje versus like Will Brooks or Alvarez or Chandler is only somewhat exciting. I mean, it's not that big of a fight, Bibiano Fernandez versus Eduardo Dantas. It's a neat fight. It's not necessarily like Fedor Dan Henderson or something like that. I mean, they're not that big of names, It's interesting enough. So that's where it just becomes a bit weird. I don't really know what Coker can really do as far as making interesting, making the big fights. I think that he would be a better opportunist about making bigger fights as they happen, though. Like I said, he would probably made King Mo versus Rampage a lot sooner than Rebney did. Otherwise, yeah, I don't see it. I just don't know what Scott Coker can really do for Bellator as far as using who's out there and making the biggest fights that he can. I can see him trying to do it, but yeah, it's just one of those wait and see things. And with that too, you got to look at the history of Scott Coker. There's some fan base that believes that Scott Coker kind of ran Strikeforce to the ground. He kind of put them in this huge debt, and that he couldn't get out of, and eventually just sold to the UFC. I've been hearing conflicting stories about that, actually. I don't know which is exactly true. But it's like, looking at the history of Strikeforce, it's like, what can Scott Coker do for Bellator, knowing what he's done for Strikeforce? And in a sense, it's like, is he the right guy for the job? Like I said, I think he'll try and co-promote. I think he'll try and get bigger fights. I just don't know. With the MMA landscape as it is, with the UFC having so many fighters, most of the best prospects out there, most of the best fighters out there, and just a large quantity of fighters on the roster with a large quantity of shows, I just don't know what Scott Coker can really do in this particular MMA landscape. If they can do a Challenger Series, we're kind of looking at a different story here. Scott Coker was good at building up guys. I mean, a lot of guys from Strikeforce have been doing really well in the UFC. And guys that were prospects not that long ago. I mean, Tim Kennedy, Luke Rockhold, Tyron Woodley, Tarek Safadine, Yoel Romero's in Strikeforce. Of course, there's Thompson Melendez. A lot of middleweights just have been doing really well. It's mainly the middleweights that have been doing particularly well. Jacare, Mousasi, all those guys, have been doing really well. If they can somehow get some sort of Challenger Series, or just, instead of the prelims being on Spike.com, if they can somehow get the prelims on MTV2 or something, I don't know, just some sort of Challenger Series, or after the Challenger Series ended, they had the prelims on Show EX, just something like that. Then Scott Coker can start building prospects and instead of putting them on tournaments, he'd be able to put them on like those type of prelims that's on TV, or like a Challenger Series, and eventually those guys graduate into the main card. I mean, Ronda Rousey actually started from the Challenger Series. Like I said, Woodley came from there. Safadine, Rockhold Kennedy. So a lot of guys cut their teeth in Strikeforce Challengers. I really like LeVar Johnson and Shane Del Rosario also were in Challengers as well. So, like I said, he knows how to build fighters in certain ways. With Rebney, he knew how to build fighters. It's kind of like luck in a sense, He would do it through a tournament, and maybe the said tournament winner will become a Pat Curran or a Will Brooks. I mean, but it's almost a product of luck, It's like, oh hey, it turns out that this guy is a young prospect whose skills are, arguably top 10. It's almost just a product of luck, that this guy ended up turning out to be such a good fighter. And it's kind of like, let's throw him in a tournament and let's see who sticks, who becomes the best fighter. And if this guy, maybe he's going to be a David Rickles, where he'd be a fun guy, a good mid-level fighter, tough mid-level fighter, but not a top fighter, necessarily not an elite fighter. They got a lot of guys like that as well, just these kind of middling guys, some guys that are kind of good, but weren't like championship material, or weren't top fighter material, or else they get like a Brennan Ward, when he fought like Shlemenko, and it's like, man, just too much too soon, because there's a lot of it's prospect versus established guy, and some guys like a Michael Chandler or Will Brooks will rise to the challenge, whereas a guy like Brennan Ward, it's just like too much, fights Shlemenko. Brennan Ward, good fighter, could be a top fighter in the future, fought a guy with too much experience in Alexander Shlemenko just way too soon. And under Scott Coker's regime, I don't think a guy like a Brennan Ward would be fighting Alexander Shlemenko so soon. If a Challenger Series existed, you'd see Brennan Ward fighting guys more on his level, and eventually getting like a bigger fight. Well, that's the other thing too. Now that I think about it, there isn't a mid-tier in Bellator per se, I mean, maybe, and they kind of need that, because it's either they're fighting prospects are fighting each other, and this is something that Coker's going to have to deal with as well. I mean, they could get a bunch of UFC rejects, I suppose, as fodder for these new prospects, but as I know Bellator right now, you either have the established guys who tend to be the champions, or tend to be just really cut above the competition that's there in their weight division, or you have prospects. I mean, there's not like a mid-tier where guys can really cut their teeth, and there's no gatekeepers per se in Bellator. It's prospects or established guys. That's it. And these established guys are top fighters. So that's going to be something that Coker would have to deal with as well. So yeah, I think overall it's a good move that this happened. I think that Scott Coker is more of a forward-thinking type of promoter. He makes big things happen, and he knows how to promote big fights. I don't know if he's going to do Rebney's thing where Rebney went to Indian casinos and whatnot because they're cheap and they're affordable. You know, it's a good cost-cutting measure, but as far as making Bellator seem... You want the television audience to see Bellator and see their venues and make it seem like they are a big deal. When you see them in these Indian casinos and the audience, you know, it doesn't... It's just not a good look. It makes them look a bit second-rate when they're in, like, more or less second-rate venues. And when they're in big venues, you know, and there's people there, it makes it seem like a big deal. You know, it's the whole idea of presentation is everything. So, you know, that's the other thing, too. I don't know if Scott Coker is going to go the Indian casino route like Rebney did. But if he goes the other route, that's going to cost money. The other thing that's mentioned is Bellator's base of operations. I believe that's a subject as well. I believe they're based out of Newport Beach, California. Not far from me, actually. Scott Coker is based out of San Jose. This is actually important because when you're based out of Newport, there isn't like this huge MMA fan base per se. There's actually a good amount of gyms around the area, but there isn't like this huge diehard MMA fan base around that area either. There aren't even, I mean, the closest venue they can go to is in like Anaheim, you know, Honda Center, Staples Center, places like that. They can do the Brand Event Center in UCI, I guess. I like that venue. I've actually been to a Bellator show in that venue. But otherwise, there isn't like this hardcore MMA fan base in that Southern California area, in that particular area. Whereas if they change their base of operations to San Jose, there's a proven audience there already. So it's kind of interesting if Bellator moves to a base camp in San Jose. That could really help. Scott Coker also has, has had dealings and whatnot with like the Shark Tank and whatnot, and just venues in that area that look good on TV as well. So, yeah, like I said, though, ultimately I think Coker is forward thinking. He'll create the big fights. I think he's a guy that will actively try and move the needle for Bellator, whereas Rebney at this point would help it survive, but that's pretty much all he can do. I don't think he had the most forward-thinking solution, or forward-thinking way of moving the needle for Bellator. So, yeah, I think that covers pretty much all the topics in regards to this happening in the MMA universe. Pretty much. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. If you have any comments, just leave them below. And that's all for MMA for you. Thank you guys very much.